Hello, everyone. Thank you, Catherine, for that very rich and humbling introduction. I'd also like to thank Julia Young for commenting on tonight's talk. Maria Mazenga was a great help from the archives, not only from when I was doing my research, but with a co-sponsorship for this talk. And I'd also like to thank Mary Tesfaye for her help with the technology and organization of this talk. It's a real honor for me to be at Catholic University speaking tonight. As Catherine indicated, there is a connection that I have. I did my master's degree in history at Binghamton University. I studied American religious history there under Rabbi Lance Sussman, who coordinated the Jewish Studies program, but also the religious history side of the department. And I wanted to pursue my advanced studies in Catholic history, American Catholic history. And we decided that I should come to Catholic U, and I arranged an appointment with Monsignor John Tracy Ellis. And we spent an entire day at Curley Hall, kind of formulating a reading plan for my master's degree at Binghamton. And so I was always very grateful to Monsignor Ellis for doing that. And I feel as though I kind of transposed the education from the department at CUA back up to Binghamton. And before I went on to do my doctorate at Marquette University in Wisconsin. I'm going to try to fly through this presentation today, show slides, of course. I'm going to let you read the material on the slides, and then I'll just kind of outline this this particular foray into what Julia Young calls both church local and church global. So there's the book cover that's just come out. It was published September 28th by Harvard University Press. Most people haven't heard of Copley Square unless you've lived in Boston, and most people have never heard of the Christian Front before. So I had a bit of an uphill climb in order to even try to get this book to publications. But one of the questions is, why the title of the book? And the answer is, there is our Nazi. He is a Nazi that was sent under diplomatic cover. He was an SS officer, Obergruppenführer, personal friend of Heinrich Himmler, worked in the Brown House in the 1920s and 1930s with Hitler and Hess and Himmler. He was sent here to Boston in 1938 to run the consulate here, among other things. And while he was here, he was an energetic spy master. And his most important recruit, in my view, was this man on the left, who no one's ever heard of, but his name was Francis P. Moran. In the 1930s and 1940s in Boston, he was a well-known figure in Boston, but again, has dropped off the history radar. And the question is, why of Copley Square? Well, as soon as Scholz arrived, he decided to fund and give direction to Moran's movement, the Christian Front, which was a branch of the public political organization put together by Father Charles Coughlin. And Scholz funded the headquarters of the Christian Front in Boston by paying for a suite of rooms at the Copley Square Hotel right in downtown Boston, in a very, very high rent district in Boston, in a lovely grand hotel. Babe Ruth used to actually live at the Copley Square Hotel when he played for the Red Sox. So that's the origin of the title. But as Julia indicated in her work, going from local to global, I think the title actually does a bit of a mental restriction for people looking at the book. The book has in it, I've uncovered a number of different spy rings that were run out of the Copley Square Hotel. One that was German, a counterintelligence operation run by British intelligence, and then much of the deliberation about the idea of a Christian Front itself was done in Rome, inside the Vatican. And then you have Soviet intelligence moving into South Boston in 1942 and 1943 to act against the Christian Front. So yeah, it's Nazis of Copley Square, but they're basically spies running all over the place in Boston during World War II, and they're all fixated on this Catholic group. That image, by the way, is a sign from Buenos Aires that someone had put up there, but it has all of the places that that this group had connections to, as we'll see. Just to start, the idea of a Christian front does not start in the United States. It starts in Britain with a recent Catholic convert named Arnold Lunn. He had converted from Methodism to Catholicism in 1933. His father was a Methodist clergyman and missionary, and Lunn converted while he was at Oxford. And by 1936, he had become a Catholic journalist and was sent to cover the Spanish Civil War. He then was convinced that he could create an ecumenical anti-communist movement if he could only persuade Protestant Christians that what he saw as the persecution of Catholics during the Spanish Civil War to be the stuff that would be the glue to bring the Catholics and Protestants, divided since the time of the Reformation, together. And so the idea he proposes is a Christian front, as opposed to the socialist communist government in Spain, who called themselves the Popular Front. He proposes a Christian front, a kind of, but without any paramilitarism, without any sense of aggression. He wants it to be a spiritual revival movement that will bring Protestant Christians and Catholic Christians together. However, you see here on the other side of the screen, Father Charles Coughlin, very famous 1930s radio preacher from the United States, who after between 1935 and 1940 becomes more virulently anti-Semitic in his speeches. Coughlin becomes also politicized, and he has about 30 million listeners weekly on the radio by 1938. He becomes a political force, as we know, and after 1936, he becomes a nemesis of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's Coughlin who takes up Lunn's idea of a Christian front. He kind of steals it from Lunn, and in my view, he mangles it and he paramilitarizes it. And by that, I mean, while Lunn's idea of the Christian front was rather benign and spiritually based, Coughlin didn't want to keep on that track, and he decides that if the communists can take up arms against Catholics, as he sees those persecutions being meted out in Spain and also in Mexico, then he says Catholics have a moral permissibility to arm themselves in a defensive position when they confront global communism, which he views as expansionist and also tied to global Judaism. So these are the themes that I'm looking at in my book. It's interesting, you know, you get caught up in there's a lot of spy stuff going on in this book, but I essentially wanted to write religious history. And I didn't want to get kind of fascinated by the espionage aspect. And what I saw were real theological elements at play in how these people operated and their motivations. And so I looked at these two theologies that were very dominant, popular in the 1930s, and no longer are so. Mystical body of Christ theology, proposed first by Pope Pius XI as early as 1922, it's basically the Pauline theology of the part to the whole, which is transnational in nature. It's a kind of a global, and in my view, it's a globalized mystical view of baptized Christians and their relationship to Christ. In other words, that borders don't matter. What matters is baptism. What matters is the sacramental life of the church, which kind of blasts through borders. And so consequently, if Catholics are being physically persecuted in various parts of the world, particularly for Coughlin, it was Mexico and Spain, Mexico in the 1920s and Spain in the 1930s, that has serious ramifications for Catholics across the globe. The Catholics in Barcelona who were being put up against walls in firing squads that is felt in Boston. And they that Catholics due to their baptismal sacramental status feel the pain of Catholics who are being persecuted by these socialist and communist political movements around the globe. Catholic Action is, as many of you may know, was that movement of social Catholicism, some would argue social uplift, or a view towards social uplift in coordination, ordinary lay Catholics in coordination with their bishops or priests, actually doing work that they consider to be anything to do that is beneficial to the church or to society can be considered Catholic action. Again, these are dominant impulses, and I think both show up. The paramilitarized and even the Nazified Christian Front believe that they are members of the mystical body of Christ, and they also believe that what they are doing is Catholic action. And I believe my research in the book bears that out. So the other issue is about how these Catholics, particularly as they move to the Boston phase, end up taking direction from a Nazi SS officer. Anti-Semitism becomes the main pillar for that activity to be able to take place. And the kind of anti-Semitism, there's a debate about whether it's anti-Semitism or racial anti-Semitism or religious anti-Judaism. I'll leave that debate for theologians, but I'm seeing the rhetoric I'm seeing in my documents is anti-Semitic. So these are Catholics who are seeing Jews from an anti-Semitic point of view, and that's something that they share with the Nazis who are recruiting them and targeting them and working with them in the work that I do. The other thing I like about this, well, the last thing is the other aspect that gives permissibility for my Catholics to work with the Nazis in particular is the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, that Judaism was at the creation and the center of the creation of Marxism-Leninism. Both, Marx's paternal grandfather was a rabbi. Lenin also had Jewish ancestry, and that there's an intertwining between whatever political philosophy Bolshevism is or communism is, and also Judaism. The two are intertwined. And then secondly, the piece about the deicide, the death of Christ, and the Jews being the primary vehicle, in fact, the exclusive vehicle for the death of Christ to take place on the cross. The one thing that I like about the book is that my last book was about popes and bishops and people that worked in the Vatican, and diplomats, about a lot of elites. This book is about street level, working class, people in the pews, Catholicism, and that's where I'm finding the religious aspects, and the sources are rich in that. And I find those sources to be really engaging. Another theme is of paramilitarism. And one of the issues I'm trying to deal with in this book is that most historians and political scientists view religion as soft power. In other words, it doesn't have any impact on geopolitics or on the battlefield, which is where, for many historians, the real activity is taking shape. What I'm finding in this is that a paramilitarized Christian front has nothing about soft power about it. They become connected with military activity and paramilitary activity, and they engage in paramilitarism. They cache weapons, they build bombs, they have created plots to overthrow governments and to arm themselves with military grade weaponry. So, for instance, these are some of the issues I get into in the book. As members of the Christian Front, they infiltrate the U.S. National Guard. They steal 2 Browning light machine guns from the Natick Armory in 1939 in order to use them in their plot to overthrow the U.S. government. They foment a congressional pressure campaign to adopt the Johnson semi-automatic rifle, something that no one really knows about unless you're kind of a gun nut. But it was basically about the adoption of the U.S. battle weapon for World War II, the U.S. battle rifle. And the Christian Front is intimately engaged in that debate, a debate that was going on in Congress. So this is for example, this is a Browning automatic rifle. It's a Browning light machine gun that shoots about 300 rounds a minute of a 30-06 shell, which is much more powerful than even the bullets that are used, and I think they're on the NATO guns today. The 30-06 is probably the most powerful round in the U.S. arsenal. It's about 3 inches long with a full metal jacket that'll go through a brick wall. And they stole 2 of these weapons of war from the Natick Armory in 1939. They also, again, were involved in a campaign to adopt a really new technology, cutting edge technology that was coming out of the New England area. It was designed a new semi-automatic rifle that I'll get into a little bit later in the show. I should have said, before I became a priest, I was a police officer. So when I was going through the FBI files, and I had about 4,200 pages of FBI files released on this case, when I was seeing actually the weapons that they were caching, how they were getting their weapons, how they were building their bombs, I kind of, because I'd been trained on semi-automatic weaponry, I'd been trained on single pump shotgun, and I'd done some target practice with the ATF at one point. I kind of, when I got to see what they were using, I kind of knew, that historians had kind of dismissed these people as no threat whatsoever. And when I saw what they were doing and the weapons that they were caching and stealing and what they planned to do with them, I actually thought, that needed to be put out there. So it starts in New York. The Christian Front starts in New York. It ultimately ends up in Boston, but it starts in New York. This is a fairly well-known case in American Catholic history, the sedition case in January of 1940. The leader in New York was a guy named John F. Cassidy, a very aggressive Irish Catholic anti-communist and anti-Semite, who devised a plot to overthrow the U.S. government because it had been infiltrated by Jews at the willing behest of President Franklin Roosevelt. And the plan of the Christian Front was what I call a false flag defensive counterattack plot. And that was that they would set off bombs. They would build bombs in their basement of their apartments in Brooklyn. They would detonate them outside and around both Jewish-owned businesses and communist front organizations, and then identify what they felt was a communist uprising in progress, and identify that to their superiors in the New York National Guard, pushing them to have Governor Lehman of New York call out the National Guard to put down this supposed uprising of communists. And as the National Guard was being called out to put down the communist uprising, the Christian Front would spring into action with their paramilitarized groups, heavily armed with military grade rifles, and fight alongside the U.S. National Guard to put down the communist insurrection and to hand over the country to its rightful Christian justified Christian leaders, and place it back into the hands of patriotic Christian Americans. The plot was crazy and bizarre and never got off the ground because the FBI had an informant inside the group. You can read about that all in the book, but they were able to get these weapons. These are all Lee Enfield rifles. This is the main battle weapon of World War I. It's a breech loading rifle that also shoots a 30-06 round. These are battlefield weapons. They were also able to get cordite shells, in other words, mortar shells, and through a loophole that I call in the book the NRA loophole. And in the U.S. Army Code, there is a little known rule that anyone who's a member of the National Rifle Association in 1939 could order a military grade rifle through the Civilian Marksmanship Office of the Department of War, and that rifle, you could order as many rifles as you wanted, and you could get them delivered to your local armory, and then for an extra $1.35 per rifle, you could have them shipped to your doorstep. So you could get military grade weaponry and cordite powder and snub fuses and ammunition all sent to your doorstep legally if you were a member of the NRA. This was something that even the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, knew nothing about when he arrested these folks in January of 1940 and the US decided to prosecute them. And there was a long trial through the spring and early summer of 1940 that caught headlines coast to coast. But as I say, since then, everyone's forgotten about. This is a headline from Boston. These headlines went coast to coast about this case, and rather extraordinary case. This was the first thing that caught my attention. Back when I was a sophomore in undergrad at Marquette, this is the case that caught my attention. I thought, man, who are these cats trying to overthrow the US government? And I thought it was a bit of an anomaly because my history professors were telling me that the Roosevelt administration was a time of Catholic assimilation in society. And I just kind of saw a bunch of Lee Enfield rifles and some squib fuses. I thought it was pretty cool. They get acquitted mainly because mainly because the prosecution is incompetent, and also because the government decided to press the government put its eggs in the basket of weapons theft from U.S. armories. Each charge there was about a 30-year charge, and they publicly played up the sedition charge, but they knew they probably weren't going to be able to prosecute on that. And as I said, FBI Director Hoover and his team had no idea that you could legally buy weapons of war through the NRA. And so they were acquitted in the summer of 1940. And there's John Cassidy, the leader of the group. And once they were acquitted, he immediately asked for his rifles to be returned to him. The FBI case in New York and the subsequent trial basically shut down the Christian Front in New York City. But it was a rather insidious philosophy, and it moved its way up to Boston, where it fell into the arms of a very energized and enterprising follower of Father Charles Coughlin, again, who no one's ever written about, named Francis P. Moran, an excellent organizer, a dropout from the seminary for the Franciscans, where he's from an Irish, the typical Irish immigrant family of 10 kids. He's the youngest child. He's bookish. He goes to study in the seminary. He leaves the seminary after about 3 or 4 years, basically because of the celibacy requirement. Fair enough. Then he comes back to Boston. But one of the things that happened in the seminary was that the Franciscan seminary in upstate New York, where he went, was all populated by German friars. These are Franciscans who'd been kicked out of Germany under the Kulturkampf. And one of the things that happens to him in seminary is he learns how to speak fluent German, and he gains an appreciation for German nationalism. So he's in Boston in 1938 as an insurance salesman and running Coughlin's Christian Front in his spare time. And lo and behold, who else shows up in Boston in 1938 is this man in the middle named Herbert Scholz. He is a high-ranking SS officer who you can read about in the book. He came up through the system. He was an assistant to Rudolf Hess, as Hess was deputy Führer. He was recruited into the Nazis by Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the Brown Shirts. He then took a doctorate at the University of Leipzig and came to the attention of Heinrich Himmler, who was then running the SS. Himmler wanted to have more astute and more socially prestigious people join his smaller group. So he recruited Scholz out from under the offices of Rome into the SS, and is sent to Boston in the fall of 1938. he's an unknown in German diplomatic history, but he's, in my view, he's the most astute espionage agent that they have. Hess actually was in charge of the espionage apparatus for the Nazi Party in Munich, and that's where he learned his trade. Scholz was sent to Boston. The press at the time, indicated that he'd made some sort of a diplomatic faux pas, was sent to Boston because he was originally assigned to Washington, then ends up moving to Boston as consul, and they thought of it as a demotion, but there was not a demotion at all. What was happening was that Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor of Germany, in this case, the third to last Chancellor of Weimar, but the one with the lengthiest tenure, a guy named Heinrich Brüning, was actually teaching in the political science department at Harvard. And after Kristallnacht, he started going public, making very loudly public anti-Hitler speeches after Kristallnacht. And so Scholz was a heavy in the SS and in the diplomatic corps. And so he was sent to spy on Brüning and clamp down on him. And you can read about that in the book, how he did that extremely successfully. He's a real heavy. So this is his boss later on. This is a quote from a letter that he eventually ends up working for in Italy for Karl Wolff, who's the highest ranking general of the Waffen SS. And this is a line from a promotion letter that Wolff wrote for Scholz from 1944. But Scholz is the people in Scholz's neighborhood are Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Heinrich Himmler. He works in the Brown House, so Hitler has his office on the first floor. Scholz is up in the second floor. So all those Hafensteigels there, all the other kind of the pantheon of Nazi leadership is where Scholz is hanging out as he learns the trade of being a Nazi. There's a photograph of Brüning, who was negotiating the role of the presidency in 1932 with 32 and 33 with Hitler, and became somewhat of a nemesis basically to Hitler, and had to flee and ended up in Boston at Harvard. So this is Scholz here about the time that he was sent to Boston. You can read, he was called Handsome Herbert in the diplomatic corps. His wife there is a woman named Lilo von Schnitzler. So she's of aristocratic lineage, and her father is the commercial chief of IG Farben, the chemical company that makes ultimately ends up making the Zyklon gas for the gas chambers. The von Schnitzlers are fabulously wealthy. Scholz is equally fabulously wealthy. He married Lilo in the late in about 1936, having dumped his former girlfriend, who was an American, who was the heiress to the Arm & Hammer baking soda fortune. So those were the sorts of people he was kind of hanging around with. And there he is in the consulate reading the newspaper. That's in the consulate in Boston under the portrait of Hitler. He's got his SS hat on the mantle there with the Totenkopf, and you can read all of the information on that slide. He was a very crafty, he was a terrific spy. He got his PhD in psychology from Leipzig, studied under a real Nazi philosopher, von Schlingnitz, who was kind of trying to move the upper tiers of the philosophical world into creating a philosophical rubric for Nazism. So he was an ideological Nazi of the first rank, and virulent anti-Semite, of course. And then this is his consulate as it appears in the spring of 1940, shortly after the Germans invade Holland. It's a rather chilling photo, especially if you're from Boston. And that's about two blocks from the State House in Boston. And that's where all the elite of Boston live. So it's quite shocking to see. So these are just some stats on what's going on with the Christian Front after Scholz recruits Moran. Moran ends up meeting face-to-face in secret, but meeting face-to-face with Scholes by July of 1940. That's the documentation we have on it. My hunch is he's taking direction from him as early as the spring of 1940. And so there you see all the stats and local clergy participation in the Christian front. Moran is an excellent speaker. He's an excellent organizer. He's a really smart guy. And he's really, really pro-Nazi and pro-Hitler. Then you have, one of the reasons I have so much material to write from is you have 5 different intelligence organizations spying on the Christian front during this period. So the sources are very rich, and all these sources are useful. It's a really interesting case, not only because of the intelligence aspect of the surveillance, but also because in essence, sometimes I have to step back some, because, there's currently, a couple days ago or a few days ago, there was that case of from California where the FBI doing surveillance and placing informants in the mosques in California. You have to step back and see, okay, what does this say for the First Amendment? The Christian front is unseemly and awful, but what is the Office of Naval Intelligence doing infiltrating the Christian front in Boston? The Army Counterintelligence Corps. It's pretty wild because all of the members of the Christian front, they're all U.S. citizens, and so I always kind of have these dual pathways when I write this stuff. Then one of the things that he's successful in is this pursuit of getting the U.S. Army to adopt the weapon you see here, the Johnson semi-automatic rifle, over the M1 Garand, which was eventually adopted. And here you see Congress is deliberating about this in the summer of 1940. The Wheeler-Walsh bill is up for passage. And so there's a real debate about which gun should be adopted for the U.S. Army. Of course, the Garand wins, but I'll let you, this is a very interesting equation. It's a simple equation. I got 6 steps that you can read. The thing here is about going back again to what is the role of religion in terms of soft power. Well, this is pretty hard power if you're talking about getting, Scholes and Moran working together to try to pressure Congress. Scholes basically gets to use the Christian Front in Boston as a pressure group to get Congress to adopt a weapon that the Germans want the Americans to adopt over the Garand. And you can read that equation and see why. And it's actually pretty chilling. And so I think this is just one aspect of how Scholes is using this ostensibly religious organization to push effectively a kind of a military and geopolitical position of the Nazis from Boston, which will have impact on the battlefield in World War II. So Moran is becoming so active in Boston, and his support in Boston is at an all-time high by the summer and fall of 1940. In June of 1940, a Jesuit at Boston College who had a radio show made a speech that gave permission for Catholics in New England to join the Christian Front, because whatever debate there was about them joining, this Reverend Michael J. Ahern, who was kind of a polyglot, he did everything from interreligious dialogue to inventing fire suppression systems. He said that despite their anti-Semitism, it's okay for Catholics in New England to join the Christian Front. Why? Because they were doing Catholic action. And so their numbers increase precipitously. That speech is overheard by William Stevenson, who is a British spy running an office out of Rockefeller Center, which is supposed to be dealing with British passports, but is actually just a spy hub. And one of the interesting parts of the book is that this book documents, in my view, for the first time, how the British mounted an intelligence campaign on American soil against Americans. They decided that they would create an organization to suppress the Christian front. Now, Roosevelt and others in the national security apparatus knew that the British were there, but the brief for the British was that they could use their spot in Rockefeller Center to counteract Nazi intelligence, not focus on Americans. And of course, keep in mind too, that you had those 5 intelligence agencies surveilling the Christian front. Not one of them, including Stevenson, knew that Sholes was working with Moran. Sholes ran circles around US intelligence and particularly the FBI. In this case, the FBI stands for fabulous but incompetent. And so what Stevenson does is he allows for the creation of a kind of a neighborhood watch system, kind of a community neighborhood organization, which calls himself the Irish American Defense Association. He sends a cutout to Boston. That's a intelligence agent that was working for the British, but whose nationality is American. And they recruit a young woman to run this neighborhood organization to try to thwart the Christian front. And it's actually a beautiful operation. They do a magnificent job, as I've uncovered in these secret files that were declassified in 2017 at the UK archives. And the other thing I found is also if the most secret operations are filed under miscellaneous. If you think about it, spies aren't going to file their most secret operations under the most secret file. So it's always in the miscellaneous files where you have to go find this stuff. And sure enough, that's what they did. And these are some documents, telegrams back and forth of the original documents were all burned. They were all destroyed by Stevenson. But Stevenson was such a megalomaniac that he made copies of all his original documents and sent them to Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill had them filed with SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which was his own personal kind of subterfuge or counter warfare apparatus. And so here's a telegram from, these are all the secret codes. You there, the person who's giving permission for the American Irish Defense Association to be created is Undersecretary of State Alexander Cadogan, most likely. And he's giving permission for Stevenson to make the choice to create this basically secret operation in America. And this is Frances Sweeney, who he recruits to do the job. And she is a lay Catholic woman, a liberal lay Catholic who is a journalist in Boston. She's very sensitive to human rights issues. She's particularly sensitive to the idea that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics is a sin. And that's, kind of foreshadowing Vatican II. She's about 25 years ahead of the game in terms of that particular sentiment. But she's a very strong liberal. She actually worked for Granville Hicks, who was a professor at Harvard and was the first open communist to have been hired by Harvard. Very interesting story there. And then these are the documents. They were able to recruit her. The cutout was able to recruit her. I have a hunch there are probably 2 people who could be the cutout in my view, but I didn't have the evidence to actually put it in the book who they are, but I have a hunch that there are 2 separate people who could fill that role. And these are the secret files from the UK. And then you have these this is an original letter actually signed by Sweeney that was written in Boston and was housed in the recently declassified secret files of the SOE, which I was able to find. And when that tranche of files was opened up and I was able to see what the British were doing, I think that's when I kind of knew I had a book. So their idea was, this was just the plan. They're going to pressure the local police and the state attorney general to suppress the Christian front. And Sweeney's organization goes to work. She's very vigilant. She's very energetic. She, by that, I mean, it's letter writing campaigns, letters to the editor, picketing, meetings, shout downs. So she basically creates an organization that is the antithesis of the Christian front, and she hounds Moran and the Christian front to get them shut down. Eventually, the British push the police commissioner to detain Moran, and And he is eventually detained in January of 1942, when he is detained for handing out books that were published by an alleged Nazi source. Then finally, in January of 1942, I noticed that a guy here named John Franklin Carter, who seemed to be President Roosevelt's personal intelligence chief, kind of his fixer, but he actually ran an intelligence department out of the White House. He was about 3 doors down from President Roosevelt. He starts talking with Moran's congressman, John W. McCormick. And the thing was, Moran was never arrested. He was detained and he promised to go underground. Mainly that the Boston Police Department had taken him off the public square by pressuring him. The books that he was selling, he wasn't even selling, he was handing them out. Those books were not at that time controversial at all. In other words, they weren't illegal. So they kind of would have lost a case in court, a free speech case. And so Moran agreed to shut down the Christian Front, and he ultimately goes underground. But this guy, John Franklin Carter, seems to be very upset that Moran has not been prosecuted and put in jail. So he puts pressure on Moran's local congressman and writes a number of memos to the president, trying to get the president to basically throw Moran in jail. And my question was, what's going on with that? Why is all that heat coming from Washington? Why should he care about what's going on in South Boston? Until I started reading an article in this magazine, this journal that I subscribed to since I was about 15, the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. It's pretty boring in Binghamton in the winter, so I just started subscribing to this, and it's a pretty cool journal. But it comes out that John Franklin Carter, most likely, there's a professor at Indiana, Professor Coyne, most likely is a thoroughly run agent by the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. So now I've got 3 different spy rings running around South Boston connected to Moran, and that's kind of fun. Finally, what happens is when he goes underground, Moran starts coordinating a lot of Irish Catholic on Jewish violence. There's basically gang warfare and rioting breaking out in the summer and fall of 1943, all coordinated by Moran as he's underground, basically living in his basement now. It's unclear whether he's getting direction from Scholes, but that's what's going on. There's huge violence taking place in Boston in the summer and fall of 1943. Catholic on Jewish violence, which is basically kept out of the press for the first few months because the Jewish community didn't want it to make the press, but there was incredible violence. And then suddenly it hits the headlines in the fall of 1943, and the governor is brought in, and eventually Moran is called on it. He denies everything, but by December of 1943, that violence tends to die down. Moran ends up staying underground and coordinating small activities until the end of the war in 1945, turning more virulently anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi. I'm going to end with this quote from Frances Sweeney, a letter from her fiance. Frances Sweeney died young. She died in 1944, having a heart attack just walking down the street, age 37. And her fiance says to her, it just doesn't, writes to a friend, it just doesn't seem right that one who could see so much evil around her and spared neither time nor courage to fight it should suddenly be taken away. To us who are left behind, her deeds should be a challenge to carry on the good which she started. So on that note, I will hand the screen back over and talk to Julia.
Okay, so thank you very much, Father Gallagher, for this. And I think we'll go directly to Dr. Young for her comment, and then we will open up the floor to your questions. If you have questions, by the way, don't feel that you need to leave them until the end. Please do put them in the Q&A so I can gather them up. Okay, Julia.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Father Gallagher. This was wonderful. The very first thing I want to say is buy this book. It is so well written. It is truly a gripping story. I wish I had the cover to flash, but I read it as a PDF, so I have this not so exciting black and white PDF to flash. But it's really a gripping read, and that's because, I mean, it's a World War II story, right? Probably our most, as history teachers, we know how attractive that is to students and to many people interested in history. It's a tale that spans a variety of places in the 1930s and 1940s. It goes not only from Francis Moran's Copley Square in Boston and John Cassidy's Flatbush, New York, but also Father Coughlin's Detroit, Franco's Spain, Hitler's Germany, the FBI's Washington, D.C., and then even a little bit of Argentina. And, you know, Mexico is there too, but I'll talk about that in a second. It's populated by British writers, a German spy, Handsome Herbert and his wife, Irish Catholics all over the place, G-men, right-wing policemen, and a brave and feisty female journalist. It tells the story of, as you say, this anti-communistic Catholic movement, the Christian Front, that is deeply anti-Semitic, that is violent, and that attracts thousands of Catholics during the World War II years and a little before. And it also importantly tells the story of some of the people that pushed back against them. And then it's a story that's been forgotten. And that's what I'd like to talk about. There are a couple things I'd like to talk about, but that's the first one. Why has it been forgotten? And I think, you know, this comes out in the book, but there are sort of two reasons. One is it doesn't fit what you call the grand narrative of US Catholic history, and what I would call maybe the benign grand narrative of US Catholic history, right? Where Catholics are first in the US, when they arrive in the US, they are a persecuted minority who then in the 20th century go on to become loyal Americans and New Deal Democrats who go off to fight in World War II, fight against discrimination, and prevail to enter the middle class and the mainstream of American life. And even when they become Republicans after the 1970s, they remain a part of in a switch from, you know, their Democratic allegiance from before, they remain part of the political mainstream. And there's no room in this narrative for a radicalized anti-democratic Catholic right wing. And so, as you point out in the conclusion, we are totally shocked when new movements on the Catholic far right arise today. So this story, I think, is incredibly important. And it's just very interesting also that benign history of Catholics in the US. When people tell the story that way, it's very important to make the case that Catholics didn't have divided loyalties, right? Because the sort of foundational accusation against Catholics was that they were going to be dangerous to the United States because they were going to have loyalty to Rome. But in a way, the story you tell us is one of divided loyalties, one where Catholics, even though this movement claims to be a patriotic American movement, is also allying itself with the Axis during World War II and with German spies. So that's a very interesting part about the ways that the benign narrative, that the grand narrative of Catholic history is subverted by uncovering this history. And there's another reason it's forgotten. I know a little less about this in the US or in the US historiography, but it's that I think, I don't want to be unfair, but I'm going to say historians of the far right perhaps don't pay enough attention to religion and to theology, right? So as you say, if historians wish, in the introduction, you say, if historians wish to shed light on the American religious right, they will have to become exegetes. Historians of the far right have to look at religion and have to understand theology, perhaps even more important than just looking at religion on a surface level. And you do that by analyzing how this belief, this understanding of the mystical body of Christ means that violence against Catholics in one place, such as Spain or Russia or Mexico, is felt by Catholics everywhere. Catholics feel they must respond. Catholic action means that lay Catholics are called into action to defend their faith. But I think that historians of the far right in the US maybe haven't done quite enough yet to connect Catholicism to far right movements. And this is certainly something that's changing a lot with historians in Mexico, where there's I'm experiencing this now as a historian who works on this, but watching the sort of flourishing of the field of, or the study of the Catholic far right in Mexico and what that meant for Mexican history. And so it's to Mexico that I now turn, maybe unsurprisingly, but I hope it's relevant and interesting for this discussion. So first, a question for you, which is that, could it be that Mexico was as important to these Catholics in the front as was Spain and Russia, right? You mentioned the cases of persecutions of the clergy in Spain and of course the Russian Revolution. And Mexico is there at various points in your book. It's not central, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be the central story. And your work is so thorough, archivally and historiographically. I think maybe the particular Catholics you studied didn't perhaps mention Mexico and the Cristero War as much as some of the ones that I've studied. Certainly there were some key Catholics talking about Mexico all the time in the 1920s. And actually before that in the 1910s. So the Mexican Revolution and the Cristero War happened before the Spanish Civil War. Bishop Francis Clement Kelly discusses it nonstop since the mid 1900s, 1913 or so. He writes a book called The Book of Red and Yellow to publicize the persecution of Catholics in Mexico. And then during the 1920s, Father John Burke at the NCWC, Francis Parsons at America Magazine are incredibly concerned about what was happening in Mexico with the persecution of the clergy during the Cristero War, this church-state conflict in Mexico. And they saw it as pure Bolshevism, and they called it that. And they were so concerned that it was happening right across the border. And then later in the 1930s, during the World War II period, really, in the 1937 through the 1950s, the Unión Nacional Sinarquista, which I'm now studying, which was often described as a Catholic fascist or a Catholic Nazi party, I argue it was much more complicated than that, drew 500,000 Mexican followers, and Father Coughlin would float the idea of funding them. So I guess the question would be, were your Catholics saying as much about Mexico? Your Catholics, the folks up in Boston and New York. Perhaps it's just that the Catholics in DC are a little more aware of them. But also, I'd like to suggest, I see parallels in this story to what actually happened in Mexico. I write in my first book in Mexican Exodus about Jose Gándara and his revolt along the US-Mexico border in 1927. He's a Mexican Catholic, a Knight of Columbus, who leads a failed revolt. And I see so many parallels to the John Cassidy story. And this might just be me drawing easy connections, but bear with me for a second. So it's an all-male movement. It's a small group. They operate clandestinely. They gather guns and ammunition. They try to launch a revolt along the border. They barely get anywhere, and they're busted by both Mexican government intelligence agents in the US, and then also by the Department of Justice and their agents for trying to overthrow the Mexican government. And the case goes to trial and is kind of minorly sensational along the border. And then the parallel character I kept thinking about during the World War II years is Salvador Abascal. Here I was drawing parallels to Francis Moran. So he's the leader of the Sinarquista movement. He's widely seen as sort of mystical and magnetic. He's almost a cult leader. Women loved him. His looks are always described, his burning eyes. There's also constant rumors of collaboration with a German Nazi named Helmut Schreider, who was a German teacher in Mexico. We don't have the paperwork to prove that. In the case of Abascal, the US Catholic Church, particularly William Montavon in the NCWC, is very supportive and very publicly apologetic of the Sinarquistas. He defends them to US government officials. He defends them in the press. He promotes he sort of instructs the Catholic News Service to publish stories about them. And then one more parallel, which I just want to point out, there's even a female journalist who rings alarm bells about the Sinarquistas. Her name was Betty Kirk, and she was a foreign correspondent in Mexico. She wasn't a Catholic. But so it's not just, I say all this not just to draw these sort of two easy comparisons between what was happening in the US and Mexico, But just to say that right-wing anti-democratic Catholic movements with key similarities are going on throughout the Catholic world, throughout Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, but then France, throughout Europe, right? And among Mexican and Latin American historians, there's a lot of debate about whether these movements were fascist or not, because that's how they were described by outsiders in the 1940s, especially by people who were opposed to them. Oh, these are Mexican fascists, Mexican Nazis. And a lot of us, not everyone, but a lot of people who studied this in Mexico say, you know, we actually think that the Catholicism here was more important than the fascism, right? They, in a way, these right-wing Catholic movements look to those fascist movements. They look to Europe, right? They look to Mussolini and Hitler and Franco, but they took what was convenient to them, and they also applied things within their own national context. So I wonder if you have anything to say about that debate. Was this fascist or not? Okay, a few now short questions, and then I'll wrap up. One is on the archives. I would love to talk a little bit more about what you did in the archives, about your archival experiences, where you went, where you worked, you've shown us already, but some of your fascinating finds. And then maybe a little bit about the mechanism of forgetting. You say the story was erased or forgotten. And I find that forgetting is something that's both a passive and an active thing, right? The news media, that kind of forgetting is a little bit passive. The media moves away, its attention moves on. But what happens in the archives to make this story disappear, if anything? And then quickly, just a few more observations. Persecution and martyrdom. This is something I think about a lot. The motivational power of the persecution of Catholics for Catholic social movements, especially movements on the right. The power of martyrdom and persecution to galvanize Catholics around those movements, to make defense of the faith worth it at any cost, to take up arms in defense of Catholics around the world, as you show, even at the cost of democracy. That was certainly true in the period you speak about in the United States. It's true in Mexico, and it's something that I think resonates today. When contemporary movements are painted as persecuting Catholic groups, and I'm thinking actually of Obama's healthcare mandate in 2011 as one example, they galvanized some Catholics to make parallels to Catholic persecutions, to historical Catholic persecutions and martyrdoms. So if you'd like to talk about the ways that any resurgent Catholic anti-democratic movements today have connections to or echo some of these historical developments, please do. Fourth, there's also an immigration story here, a story about Irish immigration. We're not talking about Irish immigrants maybe so much, but people in the second generation. Moran was the child of Irish immigrants, as you say. It seems to me that there's a story here about their inherited resentment towards the British and how that actually pushes them towards this sort of political fringes, or towards radicalization, towards anti-Semitism maybe, and towards supporting the Axis. The fact that they're actually spied on by the British in the US is the icing on the cake. So this seems like maybe something you could draw out if you'd like to, another little counter narrative to maybe more triumphalist narratives of Irish American assimilation, or Irish American Catholics moving towards the mainstream. Does this offer any challenges or changes to Irish immigration history or Irish American history? And then very, very quickly and very finally, women appear at various points in your narrative, which is wonderful. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about women. Were they the backbone of the movement? At least for Moran's movement, you talk about his female supporters and how important they were. It doesn't seem like they were so important for Cassidy. Were they essential? They were so essential in the Mexican Catholic right-wing movements that I just wanted to ask if there's any more you'd like to say about women. So I will stop talking there and turn the floor back to you.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for those amazing comments. I'm very humbled by your close reading and your enthusiasm for the book. I'm very, very grateful. I think I'll start with your question on Mexico and whether the Mexican issue had traction or gained traction in the Christian front. What I'd like to say about that is that from the top it does, that Father Coughlin is talking about Mexico. Father Coughlin is always concerned about Mexico. He's mentioning the Cristero Wars. He is promoting the cult of Miguel Augustin Pro. And so he's always concerned, but the people I'm dealing with, so basically, I didn't want another book on Coughlin. I think we've got so many books on Father Coughlin, and okay, I just didn't want to write another book on Coughlin. What I found fascinating were these foot soldiers. And so the foot soldiers are people that Coughlin winds up, and he lets them make the decisions about what they are going to use for propaganda. And he has confidence and trust that they are going to use the localized situation to their best advantage. So they tend to not speak about Mexico so much, but they speak about the more recent past, and they speak about the Spanish Civil War, which to them is a black and white issue, and it's easier for them to articulate on the street corners. The other thing that I've been thinking about lately on this issue of Mexico is that I think that the Mexican situation is early enough so that it defies an adaptation to technology. And what I mean by that is at the Christian Front meetings in both New York and Boston, they roll in 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter film projectors, and they show films on the Spanish War. They show propaganda films, Catholic propaganda films. There's this one that makes the rounds called Spain in Arms. And I've tried to find a copy of it, but there doesn't seem to be any extant copy. But so in their meetings now, in their street meetings, both in New York and in Boston and in Philadelphia, they're showing by 1938 and 1939, they're showing 35 millimeter films, where I think that even 10 years earlier, it's not possible to get the same emotive traction that they got from these films that they were showing. And Moran is very, very capable as someone who screens. Moran screens Nazi propaganda films in Boston as late as July 1941. But he does the same thing for the Spanish Civil War, about the Spanish Civil War. And so on the Mexico thing, I think it's because the technology lent itself to be more connected to the Spanish situation than to the Mexican situation. It might have been just a question of timing and technology. Then you asked a bigger question about why was it forgotten? This is a question that has kind of badgered me for a long time, because I got to say, when I was a sophomore in college, I went to my professor and asked him if I could write a 10-page research paper on the Christian Front, and he said no. And he said no because nothing happened, they're insignificant, they don't matter. And besides, he directed me to a book, someone's already written a book chapter, and the case is mentioned, and the case fizzled, and it was inconsequential. So in my view, that was the status in the profession for 70 years, it was inconsequential. And the thing is, they didn't detonate any bombs. They didn't shoot any guns. And I can understand that. But when I was looking at the group, even as a sophomore, I said, something's happening here. What are the messages telling us? What can we learn from this anomaly? And I was kind of fascinated by that. And so in my first book, Vatican Secret Diplomacy, I got to see what those people at the Vatican were doing, and they were writing about this group. and they had Pope, Cardinal Pacelli, later Pius XII, had serious correspondence about this case in New York. Why was it forgotten? Well, I think both institutions wanted to forget it. The church was definitely had a benefit in forgetting it, and forgetting it quickly. And the state also had a benefit in forgetting it quickly, because their prosecution of the case was horrific, and their surveillance of the organization was amateurish at best. The FBI was absolutely had circles spun around them by both Moran and the Christian Front. Some of our participants may have recalled the sedition trial in 1944, the Great Sedition Trial, where 29 seditionists were put on trial. And it was another example of a fiasco of a prosecution. But the only real spy that actually should have been indicted and prosecuted and sent to jail of all those 29 was Francis Moran. And they never even, somehow he skirted an indictment by the grand jury. And yeah, it's a crazy story. So so then you had a question about fascism in Mexico. And some of the research that I found is I've been doing research on a different topic. A guy named George Dietheridge, who started a group called the American Nationalist Confederation. Dietheridge was working with Nazi intelligence as early as 1938. And between 1938 and 1940, he had contacts with the gold shirts in Mexico. So what was happening, in my view, from what I can see in the documents I look at, is that the Nazis were they were targeting this gold shirt movement. I don't know really much about it at all. To me, it's reminiscent of the disco era when people would wear gold shirts on the dance floor. But so I don't know what they're about, but they're a fascist movement in Mexico, and that's where the Nazis were heading. And so that's why they don't show up. But in terms of Dietheridge's work, they will. Your other question about archives, one of the more fascinating archives I was able to look into was an archive that's really was off the map, and I only stumbled onto it from a footnote in a locally published historical journal. A journalist named Arthur Darunian was an Armenian journalist who had come to America, gotten a journalism degree at Columbia, and then infiltrated right-wing movements from, I think, 1935 to 1940. He ultimately writes under he takes a second name, John Roy Carlson, and writes a book, Undercover, about that experience. His personal archive is about 75 boxes of his verbatim conversations with American fascists. And it was about to be thrown out, actually. His widow was actually going to take this up, but someone in their church, in their Armenian church, got her in touch with the archivist at the Armenian American Association Archives, and they've saved that archive. Those verbatims were fascinating. So in other words, I had this Avedis Darunian having sit-down meetings with Moran in his home in 1940, 41, and 42. That's just gold. And Moran is talking with him openly, because Moran is of the opinion that Carlson is a sympathetic fascist, and it's just wild stuff that comes out. And so you get the real measure of the man and his movement. You talk about resurgent Catholic anti-democratic movements today. I got to say, as a historian, basically I look at what I read in the newspapers. When it comes to being a theologian, I like to study the theology of the 30s and 40s. I like to study that theology from the perspective of historical theology. What I'm actually as a historian, what I'm interested in is most people wouldn't define him this way, but I do see some shades of kind of resonant Catholicism in Bannonism, what I call Bannonism, kind of Steve Bannon's kind of populism. And I think although he doesn't acknowledge himself as a practicing Catholic, he has acknowledged a connection to Charles Maurras in the past, in a speech he gave at the Vatican, by the way. So I really, I think, and he's Jesuit educated, a thing that the Jesuits don't ever really like to acknowledge. He did a security degree at Georgetown. So he's, he knows the theological streams. And I think it'd be interesting to look at his kind of more contemporary views in terms of Catholicism. I think that'd be interesting. On the immigration issue, I'm going to defer to you on that. I don't know if it offers us something new to say about Irish immigration. I don't think I'm really conversant enough with the latest Irish American immigrant historiography to really make a statement on that. But when I was writing the book, it seemed to me that he fit into the contours of that period, except for the appropriation of anti-Semitism. I'm not, that is, I don't know, that'd be a more interesting article. How does that Irish experience allow him to latch onto and lock into the anti-Semitism? So the role of women, I do try to show in the book that 60% of the Boston Christian Front, at least 50% were women, that they were very engaged in the organization. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these women, while they were attracted by Moran and his speech, they didn't know that he was receiving direction from Scholz, from a Nazi. And so all of that was secret. And I'm sure that would have made that would have had an effect if they knew that. There is a lot more work coming out on women and the right wing, and it does seem that it seems strange to our ears, but that women were attracted, as you're finding in Mexico, that there is a feminization of the right that takes place. I found that in Boston. I wasn't able to get as much of that. The observations that I was getting from New York, those writers didn't make any note of the ratios between men and women in the Christian Front. The other thing that's a problem is that in both New York and Boston, Cassidy and Moran were able to destroy or hide the membership information from the feds. So we never get a list of actually who joins. And so with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you so much. Those were fantastic answers.
Thanks to both. Thanks to both of you. Thanks, Father Gallagher, for that wonderful presentation and your answers to Julia's questions, to Dr. Young's questions, and thank you, Dr. Young, for that really compelling commentary. So we do have two comments. We do have two questions in the queue. So I invite you to send us more questions, because we certainly do have some time. So let me get to those questions right away to make sure that we would deal with them as they come in. So we have one from a former graduate student, a former PhD from the Department of History just last year. From Katja Morris, and she's asking, how do we get from the Christian Front to Nostra Aetate, a remarkable volte-face, in the space of barely 20 years?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because in 2012 or 2013, the excellent historian John Connolly wrote the book From Enemy to Brother, which is a history of Catholic Jewish interreligious, interfaith dialogue, which talks about that question. This case is left out. This case is, as the subtitle indicates, forgotten. And so how this case impacted the arc of that movement is unclear to me. And I think that movement to Nostra Aetate, and I'm very sensitive to this dynamic now because of how my first and second books were constructed. Nostra Aetate, having read and reviewed Connolly's book, is a conversation at 30,000 feet between theologians and rabbis and cardinals and popes. And what's going on the street is baked in anti-Semitism, which provides political action and which can produce, in my view, because the 30,000 foot view is its own thing. But 4 years ago in Boston, we had an incident where Catholic high school students chanted anti-Semitic slogans when they were playing Newton North in basketball. So on the street, Nostra Aetate was nowhere to be found. And I think I'm hoping that when a history at the street level, if that can get out there, that people can start thinking about the actual operative case of anti-Semitism and how we still need to figure out and to figure out how to eradicate any vestiges of that. It's not there at 30,000 feet, but it might still be here on the street, and because its history is a long one. So that's how I'll answer that. Thanks.
Thanks for that response. And again, I invite questions from the audience. I know this isn't the easiest way to have a discussion, but please do put your questions into the Q&A. Okay, we have a question from a current graduate student from Jane Mashew. There was a strong anti-clericalist and anti-Catholic strain in the leadership of the Nazi Party. What is your sense of the attitude of Scholz and the other Nazi leaders towards the Christian Front?
So I think having studied Scholz for so long now, I was able to find through his SS file that he in fact was a Lutheran. I found through my other digging in the archives that he was thoroughly an opportunist. And so what that meant was he was recruiting Moran. At the same time, he was recruiting a guy named George Johnson Armstrong, who was a communist. Now, if Moran had ever found out that Scholz was meeting one day with a communist and the next day with him, because it was during that period of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, if he had found out that Moran was meeting with, that Scholz was meeting with a communist one day and him the next, he would have dumped Scholz, I think, because his anti-communism was so strong, and so in Scholz's view, Scholz viewed Moran as a target by which he could effectuate the goals of National Socialism, not necessarily any kind of religious goals. There was a case, however, where Scholz did give kind of a sop to Moran. There was a nun who was of French descent who was captured in France. She was from New Hampshire, and Scholz made a démarche to the German army to try to get this nun from New England released from a camp where she had been detained, essentially a prison camp where she would remain the rest of the war. And he made sure that Moran knew that he was doing that. But in my view, he was only doing that in order to continue to run Moran as an agent. And Moran was not only a terrific agent for him, but was a terrific recruitment for him, because the FBI was always looking for German agents within the German American Bund and the cultural societies. They didn't think that first generation Americans would ever work for the Nazis. So they placed all their surveillance on Kuhn and the German American Bund, and these Zollverein and these cultural organizations, they totally missed the Christian Front. And in fact, in the book, there's an FBI agent who writes a report, which I describe as spacey, saying, he writes down, this FBI agent writes down at the end of his report, gosh, if this guy weren't Irish, you'd think he was German. And it's kind of like, yeah, so that's how it's going at that point. And so in other words, to answer the question more fully, I think it was more about meeting the goals of National Socialism than it was about trying to be meeting Moran's religious zealousness. Now, they were on the same page with anti-Semitism. They mutually supported one another in their anti-Semitism. That was a big piece too.
Thank you for that. There's a couple of questions that just came in. All right, so I will put myself on hold while I turn to the questions that have just come in. So from our colleague in modern languages, Chelsea Stieber, thank you for this fascinating discussion. You mentioned Charles Maurras in the present context with Bannon's ideas, but were there connections to some of the leagues and fascist or fascist adjacent religious groups in France at the time? I've looked into his papers, and there is a sizable correspondence with people in the US from the early 20th century. So that's our first question.
Okay, would you like me to answer that now? Yeah, so I'll answer that as best I can. And I think this is something I didn't put in the book, but I should have. And it's the connection with Sentinelism, which is Maurras's movement as it's transported from France over to Canada. So it's the elite in Quebec, the Catholic elite in Quebec, that are mainly the old monarchists, and they're doctors, lawyers, educators, and particularly priests. And between 1900 and 1924, there's a huge kind of emigration from Quebec into New England in particular, and into Rhode Island and to New Hampshire, of these former kind of Maurrasian political followers. And they create a movement called Sentinelism, which in the 1920s, the early to mid 1920s, manifests itself as what looks like internecine squabbles between these French Canadian Catholics and their bishop over kind of nationalism disputes and language disputes in the parishes. But in essence, it's also a movement that has political substance to it. And in many ways, I think there is this residual by the 1930s, by the late 1930s, there is this kind of residual kind of Catholic, almost kind of French-inspired Catholic anti-Bolshevism and kind of Maurrasian kind of quasi-monarchism, and that is still left around in New England. And I think that's why the numbers become so strong in New England.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And we have a question from one of our graduate students, another of our graduate students, Amos Bronner. Do you think that the Christian Front differed in its operations from other fascist organizations because it was Catholic? If so, how did such differences manifest themselves?
Well, I think thank you for that question. Excellent question. I think the main difference, which you can read about in the book, is on race. That there were African-American members of the Christian Front. Francis Moran had a correspondence with Lawrence Dennis, who was a biracial theoretician of American fascism, graduate of Harvard. Moran idolized Dennis. There's a great book on Dennis called The Color of Fascism, which talks about him and his biracial background and what that meant for fascism in the United States. So they're not concerned with white supremacy, mainly because baptism indicates a shared uniformity, a universality of redemption and salvation. And so there is no, so it's really interesting. It's not, for them, Nazism isn't about white supremacy. It's about the main pillar here is a shared anti-Semitism with Nazism. And I think that's the difference from what we have today. But very good question, very interesting. And if you, in the book, I do go into that, and it's even more fascinating than I was able to kind of indicate here.
Thanks. I encourage more questions. I'm going to step into the queue myself until we have, well, we don't have too much time, but certainly we have time for a question or two. So I wanted to say that I really appreciate, as a historian of religion myself, but of course, religion from centuries before you study, I appreciate your emphasis on Catholicism and theology as a motivating factor here. But I also wondered about whether you could sort of highlight or foreground the question of class here, which seems to be so much part of the story. And so again, I say that I really do appreciate the emphasis on religion, but it seems like class is a little bit muted, and there's probably a lot more to say about class, and you probably do say a lot more about class in the book. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
So it's a little more difficult to talk about class when you're writing about the right wing, because they don't view themselves as having membership in a class structure, as would a socialist. They view themselves as capitalists. They view themselves as workers, but not as workers in order to organize into workers' councils. For them, for Moran, it's not about labor unionism as the core negotiation between the state and class. It's the family. And so this is where I think class gets a little attenuated. And it goes back to Moran's vocation. In my view, I think that Moran always considered himself in the back of his mind a failed priest, and that the Christian Front organization was his movable parish, and that he was, in fact, a religious leader. And he viewed himself as a preacher and as a pastor. And so the negotiation point for him as leader of the Christian Front was not about labor organization or class organization. It was about the strength of the family. And you see this in the book in his comments about family life and about sexuality in particular, which I won't get into because they're pretty graphic, but it's connected to it's connected to family life, and it's connected to his view of the family unit as the negotiating point, not only between government, but in terms of property ownership. And he ties all of that into the theology, the Augustinian. He talks Augustinian theology in these meetings. These political meetings are somewhat like if someone were to read the daily newspaper, stand up on a stage in front of 500 people and theologize about the headlines and the newspaper articles they wrote, and interject the theology from anything from Augustine to Aquinas into the daily headlines. And that's how he grew his numbers. He was that he was that well equipped to do that. And if you look at it, he did have theological training, and he had the one thing that most of his companions in Boston in the high schools didn't have. He had public speaking training. And in many ways, I think this was his parish. This was his movement. And he was kind of the bishop, and he held forth. And it was a quasi-political movement. I don't know if that answered your question entirely, but that's what I'm getting. That's kind of the sense I'm getting from Moran, both Moran and Cassidy, I would say.
Okay, I think we have Dr. Young has a question.
Well, I have the classic comment question, but I
Okay.
feel like since there's a little bit of an opening, we have just a couple minutes left. I keep thinking about what you said about not being discouraged from doing this project because this was a movement that didn't matter, and it was a movement that lost, and it was a flash in the pan, and these guys were losers. And I just think, since we have grad students on the call, oh, and I see another question, so I'll be quick. But since we have grad students on the call, I just think your book offers such great evidence for why it's so important to study movements that lost, right? Because, and you say it so compellingly. I was trying to find the last page. You say it so compellingly on the closing paragraph of your book, that we forget about them and then they come back, right? Like, these movements they might have lost, but their adherents survived, and the ideas that fueled them survived. And so I just think for grad students, and for anyone that is being discouraged by more senior historians, I guess, from studying that kind of thing, like, study the lost causes, right? They're really important. Question mark?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I remember at one point I had to deal with the National Archives, and they were telling me that there was no FBI case file for the Christian Front. And I said, there has to be, because it was a huge case in the spring of 1940. And they said, no, we've looked at our files, nothing exists. We don't have anything under that name, anything under those people's names. There's nothing there. And I said, there has to be. And they said, well, we need a case number. So I went back, did some research online, and I found a case number. And of all places, a website I've never been on since. I'm not even sure what it is, but called Reddit. So I was on Reddit, and I think it was like some neo-Nazi put up this FBI case number, and I scratched it down, and it looked to be to fit the contours of what I would need for a case number. I went back to the National Archives, and I said, this, I think, is a case number. They went back into their inventory, into their files. They came back, and the guy's face was crestfallen, because he said, oh yeah, that's the case number. We found it. And it was 2,500 pages long for that file. And I had to have 3 negotiations with the FBI to get it released. And then it was just a blast reading through those documents. But if, don't get discouraged. The documents are there. You can dig them up. You can find these crazy archives that aren't on the usual databases. Just search for them and figure it out. I also basically, my first book proposal got torpedoed. My first book was with Yale, and then this book's with Harvard. Well, this book should have been with Yale, but Yale torpedoed my book proposal because one of their experts said nothing happened, no bombs went off, the old line that I was getting. And so it's not useful to write about this. And so basically I ended up, I hope you won't be offended, but I ended up praying because I was on the tenure track and I didn't have a book project. So and so I ended up praying, and the result of my prayer was just keep doing what you're doing. And I said, I'm going to write an article about the Boston Christian Front, because nothing's been written on the leadership of the Boston Christian Front. And in the course of that research, I uncovered this relationship between this Nazi and Francis Moran, and then it was just off to the races.
The power of prayer. All right, we have one final question, and it's a question from one of our graduate students, and it's a wonderful closing up question, concluding question. I'm wondering about the post-war ramifications of this, which is a bit beyond the scope of this discussion, I guess. I'm thinking about the FBI, McCarthyism, and the like, and post-war paranoia, and this is from Michaela Bailey.
So I think I'm in sympathy with the gist of your question. I think it starts here. I think I think that you have similar impulses, similar ideas, similar public discussions that are impacting the anti-communism of McCarthy and the Catholicism of McCarthy. The historical impact is, in my view, quite resonant today. By 1945, Francis Moran is out of the picture of the leadership, and in steps this priest from Boston, who's a short-lived kind of celebrity of the Christian Front, but a member of the Christian Front named Arthur Terminiello. And in 1949, he takes a free speech case to the Supreme Court, where he's arrested in Chicago for anti-Semitic speech, for an anti-Semitic speech he gave in Chicago in 1946. And it's his Supreme Court case that allows for the speech that pervaded in Charlottesville in 2017. There was a high level of anti-Semitic speech in Charlottesville. And a lot of the reporters at the time were kind of running around saying, how can these protesters utter those slogans, those anti-Semitic slogans, and get away with it? And when they checked with their legal advisors, the legal advisors said, well, it's this case, Terminiello v. USA, 1939. And Terminiello was a member of the Christian Front and spoke multiple times in Boston. So there is resonance today, in my view. This has been wonderful. Thank you. It's really been engaging. It's been terrific. It's been a real honor, incredibly enjoyable, and so much fun.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your stimulating presentation, and both of your stimulating presentations from Father Gallagher and also from Dr. Young. And it was just great to see so much graduate student presentation or participation. So thank you for that. Thank you for eliciting all of that graduate student participation. So, and thank you, audience, for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry in this format that we don't see you, but we'll meet again one day.
We know you're here.
Right. All right. Well, again, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, presenters. Thanks, audience. And I hope we'll see you again on November 30th. Okay. Good night.
Oh, and buy Father Gallagher's book on Amazon.
Yes, I'm sorry, we don't have, I was about to put this into the chat function, right? I was about to put, but we don't have the chat.
Amazon has the best price on that.
Okay, there we go.
Your publisher told me to plug Amazon, which is why I am. So
okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good night,
Thanks, Catherine.
everybody. Okay.
Thanks, Julia. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.